Well, welcome back, everyone. Glad to see you. Let's get started. Selling and marketing logs is our main topic, and also, as I mentioned, contracting. But I thought I'd just start right out with a poll, and I'm actually going to start an official poll to see how many of us in this audience have ever sold logs or timber. Of our group tonight, about a third of us said yes, they sold logs. One says no, don't plan to. And then no, don't, but I do plan to, or I might. And actually the majority is I might. So actually I'm going to ask you, so those of you that did sell logs, if you're willing, why don't you turn your microphone on and share a little bit. One of the questions I'd ask you is, did you work with the logger direct? Did you do it yourself? Anybody do it themselves? Cut their trees and sold their logs themselves? See if anybody says yes to that. Okay, next question. Who here worked directly with a logger, hired a logger?
I did.
Is that
Yeah, we
Michael?
did.
Yes.
We did too.
Okay, is
Sarah
that Dort?
Johnson.
Yeah, so how did that go? Michael first.
We're very happy with the logger we have. We've actually worked with two. We worked with one a number of years, or actually my mother did when she was alive, and he was a friend of the family, but he's retired, and so after we inherited the property, my brothers and I, with recommendations, we found a logger, and he's done a very good job doing what we want, which is basically selectively picking some trees and leaving the rest.
Okay, and then how big of a job have you done, or how many loads of logs did you ship?
We've done a piece each of the last 4 years, and this year will be the last time. And we've done something a little over 100,000 board feet each year.
Okay, good. Yeah, well, it might be important when we get into the Q&A and people talking. We'd like you to contribute and share, because especially in this topic, there's a lot. It's just all about sharing experience and how do you find a good logger, and or what works for you and how do you get it done right, because there's so much at stake. And Dorothy, did you say you had done some logging?
Well, yes, we have done logging, my husband and I, 2 different times. I was on the fringe of that both times, and so now I'm stepping up for this next time. But I do remember both times were pretty small. And that was part of the problem is that one of them was actually logged and never got picked up. And so that was not a very good experience. And that was from a local guy, and it just that didn't pan out how we wanted it. And then, but the second time we did we got a small load, but I can't give you numbers or the abbreviations. I'm still learning all of that. What Mike was just talking about, I was all ears. So
okay, well, that's
so
why we're here together.
Small load to try to pick through and try to. So I'm trying to learn just how you get it, how you get it all done.
Excellent. Well, actually, that covers quite a spectrum, because those are common experiences. Just a little bit to do, and how do you get that done versus something more substantial. And of course, the key, what Michael was talking about, is really finding somebody that you trust, that you see the results of their work, you have confidence, and you move forward. That's the best case scenario, and to avoid that situation where it didn't work out. So any others?
Can I add some more information?
Oh, sure, go ahead, Michael.
What we did is 4 years ago, we had about 25 acres that we wanted to selectively log. And so a logger had been recommended to us by one of my brother's friends. So we asked him to do it, but we made it clear to him that he was in essence on probation, or that whether we turned him loose on more of the property was based on how happy we were with the job he did on this first area. And he did a really good job, and he hasn't slacked off. So that kind of, since we weren't interested in a humongous payday in 1 year, we wanted to spread it out over a number of years. The, kind of having him audition seemed to work really well.
Oh, yeah, good point. All right, anyone else?
This is Sarah Johnson. I am new to this, but my family has had our forest for a long time, and we have a logger who his dad was our logger before him with my grandpa and my dad, and then now he is our logger. And I feel like we're really lucky in a lot of ways because he does a lot of stuff for us. Right now we have about 13 loads that are going to Georgia Pacific. And this is my first hands-on experience with him for me managing the place, but he's done lots and lots of logging for us over the years. But one of the things that I really feel fortunate about having a professional help with is that he has a good relationship with the mills, and he keeps a close eye on prices for us and talks to the buyers, and he's done a great job negotiating for us. And that's something that I know at least my dad used to do that himself, but I know my mom in her time never felt comfortable doing that. I would feel comfortable doing it once I know a little bit more, but I have a lot to learn. But that piece has been really helpful to me because he's got that relationship with the mills. So it's a little bit more turnkey.
Yeah, and that's an important aspect of selling logs, is having somebody who has that relationship with the mills, and there's a mutual understanding there and respect that helps everything work. Has anyone worked with a consulting forester as your agent to work with loggers or mills? Both sides of the.
No, I haven't.
Okay. Yeah. Right. Brad, did you want to say something? Guess not. All right. Well, that's a good start. I just wanted to get that conversation going. And one of the advantages of getting together with other woodland owners is really the sharing of experiences. And we'll talk about that a bit more as far as when it comes to finding help. So, a really important part, if you're considering any kind of harvesting, it's about planning, about really thinking ahead. Now, with the forest fire, or disasters like fire and ice storms, of course, you didn't have time, you didn't plan this. it happened. And so then you feel like you're behind. But a first key thing here is falling back on your objectives and your reasons you own your land and what your vision is. And so then the decision to harvest, or even responding to a disaster, and how you choose to handle and pick up the mess and all that, you really want to fall back on your basic objectives and your plans. And as much as possible, don't let the sudden exigency maybe knock you off your course when there might be a way that you can stay on your course. And then of course, when it comes to talking with foresters and talking with contractors or loggers, if you don't know your vision and aren't really clear on your objectives, you're going to get different opinions, and people might sway you. and I'll talk about that later in some real examples. And then of course, the timing of things. I mean, right now, if you've got a need to do some harvesting and you don't have a relationship with a logger or a forester, it might take you a while. You have to get in line, and especially with how busy everyone is with the fire salvage and with now the ice storm, and also just their existing client load. I know I'll tell my story a little bit later, but it took me a couple of years to find a logger that I was confident with, and find one that would call me back or that didn't tell me, hey, talk to me next year, I'm too busy this year. So planning ahead and the timing is going to be important. And if you are crunched for time, that puts you at a disadvantage. If you have to hurry up, you may have fewer choices. So it's best, of course, if you've got more time to line things up and find the right service providers. And then, of course, pretty early on, you really need to know where your property lines and your access easements are, if you have those. because you're going to be needing to bring in the contractors and the equipment. And then it's really important to have a safe route in and out for your contractors and the logs that you're selling. And sometimes that it can really prevent a lot of progress if you can't get that figured out, knowing exactly where the lines are and the roads and the access. And of course, seedlings, tree seedlings, when you harvest, if you harvest enough to trigger the need to plant more trees or trigger enough daylight for your trees to grow, it takes 1 or 2 years to get the seedlings, and normally we expect to order them that far in advance. And now it might, depending on how many you want, you might even need to be thinking longer because of the bottleneck with the great demand for seedlings. So we talked about that during the reforestation part. So kind of get these things in mind up front, and hopefully you can be prepared. And then a key thing especially for smaller acreage owners and people that don't have experience with this, is that it can be, there's a wide range of potential economic viability, and a lot is determined on how much is there. If there's a very low volume of wood to sell, that can be hard to make it work. It may not be feasible, and you may have a hard time finding someone to do that. And that could be just the total volume, and also if it's a very small volume per acre. And by volume, we're talking about the wood, how much wood is there. And we'll talk about terminology a bit, but you may have heard terms like board feet, or also there's sometimes logs are sold by weight, so that'd be by tons. Those are the two common measures. Internationally, we use cubic meters or cubic volume as opposed to a board foot volume. So we'll talk about that a bit. But if there's a very scattered small volume, that may not be economically feasible, or may be hard to make it go, or at least you should not expect to make money. Then the size of the timber or the trees, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But in general, it takes a tree that's at least 8-10 inches in diameter to have a log that could make a saw log, which is usually at least 5 inches on the small end of the log, 20 to 40 feet long. So if your trees are smaller than that, then of course that, there may not be good market options. And then overall the quality, if they have rot like this or damage, and the wood's not going to make good products, and of course that would be make it difficult. And then all the aspects of the land and how difficult is it to get in there, what kind of equipment would be suitable. Really steep slopes require specialized equipment, or cable logging with towers and things that are more expensive. Things that reduce the productivity of the logging operation. That means it takes them a lot more time to get a truckload of wood ready and on a truck. And that's going to, of course, affect the economic viability. That cost goes up. So I hope in the reading, those of you interested in, in this topic, and I hope most of you are to some extent, because you kind of want to know what's involved, and even if you're not planning to do it for a while, the basic steps. So I did refer you to several different sources in your reading or your web resources about those steps, and I'll go into that a little bit here because there are quite a few steps, and because this can be very important. Even 5 or 10 acres of trees can add up to a very significant value. And of course, if it's your only 5 or 10 acres or a very important part of your land, then the consequence of doing it and doing it properly and how they leave it, is really, that's very important to you. And so getting it right is extremely important. And in terms of logging and selling logs, starting out just by knowing what do you have to sell, and knowing your access and the roads and the ability to get it out, it gives you a starting point to understand, again, that economic viability, but also we might just say the operational feasibility of can you achieve your objectives. If you went out on your land and you marked 20 trees and you said these are the ones I want removed to make room for others to grow, who's to say how feasible that is actually to get those done with the access that you might have. So as I get started on this fairly long list of steps, really key thing is deciding, well, how much of this do you want to figure out for yourself? And then the actual work and making the arrangements, do you want to take charge and do all of that? And some woodland owners like to learn all these steps if they haven't already, and they do all of these things themselves. But this is really a key part where hiring a professional might be the best move, and a consulting forester, or even the logger whom you've gotten to know and trust that can do a lot of these things from this step forward. So once you get started thinking, I have a reason to cut some trees, I have a reason to sell some logs, and now I think I have the ability to get it done based on what I have in the roads, and maybe that even as a starting point where you need professional help to assess, what you have clearly. That's a topic I'll talk about as well. But you might want professional help here. And then the longer part of this list, I'm not even going to try to get into all the details on this. Brad and I were discussing this, and we have 1-day and 2-day workshops all about this, where we get people together, and you can meet consulting foresters and loggers and hear from more extension professionals about the ins and outs of this. So you can really learn a lot and be well educated to go forward and feel confident in doing a timber sale, even if you are hiring someone. So the way that you sell it, the type of sale, how you get buyers, bids, selecting that logger. Some of the homework that we gave you, or references that we gave you, are choosing the right service provider, hiring a logger, 20 questions that you ask to find out if this is the right logger for you. And then of course the laws, forest protection laws that we touched on last time. You need to notify the Department of Forestry. And of course, it's good to notify your neighbors and others who be next door affected by a logging operation, which can sometimes be quite an adventure for the neighborhood, depending on how things go. And just watching how it goes once it gets started. And then again, that last step of getting new trees in the ground, reforestation. So I'm going to touch on some of these things, but again, not going too deep into it, just as Brad called it, a survey course. But a key part of this starting point is you're thinking that you want to cut trees, and for silviculture, for thinning, or even the strict goal of making money, and anything in between. The inventory of what you have, knowing what you have, is of course the first part of marketing, is knowing what the value is of what you have. And of course, in the case of logging, some of the things we described, that depends on how much it costs to deliver it to the marketplace. The net value, when all the costs are paid, what would you make in the end? And so that would come down to very specific attributes of the quality, species, size, value, and quality of the logs that you end up trying to sell. Those actual diameters and lengths of the logs that reflect exactly what the buyer is looking for. And again, the log buyers, the mills, or intermediaries, they're going to have fairly specific criteria for the kinds of logs they want, and how much trim and extra length is required on a 40-foot log, let's say, that's going to go on a truck and be delivered to a mill. And then that gets you closer to figuring out this economic viability. And the road and the access to make sure the equipment can go in and out and move those logs is often a really key part of that, especially if there's any road building involved, which could be quite expensive. Or it would determine the season that you can go in. If you don't have a winter road like this rock road that's being constructed that would allow logging during the wet season, then you might be needing to add a lot more costs to the operation. Then there's the type of prescription. Are you looking at doing a clear cut versus a thinning or a selective harvest? And that's obviously is a huge part of the complexity, and then the cost, and also the quality of the work and the skill of the operator to do a thinning or a selective harvesting of large trees, removing a 150-foot tree that's 2 feet in diameter without damaging or minimizing the damage to other trees. You need a lot more skill and equipment for specialized abilities for that than you would for a clear cut harvest, for example. Then of course, I'm kind of spending a lot of time on the roads, because that is really the first and foremost part about access to move those big pieces of wood around. And that also is your access for managing your forest, and decisions about your roads. Are they adequate for what you want to do? The season of use for that road, again, needing, a road that has a good rock base and good drainage if you're going to be using it in the wintertime or the wet season. And it can be fairly complex and expensive. And once you have a road that needs maintenance, and water quality implications, environmental aspects of roads are the primary cause of chronic water quality issues in the forest. And so if the roads aren't built right, or if they're not drained right, and they deliver muddy water to the creek, that's a problem that has to be addressed and fixed. It's actually a violation of the forest practice rules to deliver muddy water to a creek. So that's why they're regulated, and that's why they're really important. Of course, they're important for your access for all the other reasons you want access as well, depending on what kind of access you want. So I mentioned, what type of timber sale, and just briefly, there's two major types. And one is what we call a stumpage sale, or selling trees on the stump, meaning that you're selling the tree, so it's going to be cut down, and then we'll leave a stump. But you can sell the standing trees, and the buyer buys those. And there's a couple of different ways that's done. But that really requires that you kind of know what you have to sell. And then the logging and all of the aspects of removing those trees and finding the log buyers, et cetera, that's all up to the purchaser of the standing timber. Now, it's very common for large landowners that really know what they're doing to offer for sale, here's a 100-acre timber sale, and they offer it to someone who will pay for the stumpage. And so the buyer takes all the responsibility. They say, here's my bid, and it's up to them to get the loggers to deal with the road work or whatever's needed to deliver the logs and get paid. And they pay often up front or in installments. And that can be done pay as they go, so that they pay on a rate per 1,000 board feet. And that's a term we'll talk about, but in Oregon, we're often selling wood by the board foot, or the 1,000 board feet. And that's based on the log itself being measured or scaled to estimate the amount of lumber that comes out of it. And that's what log scale is about. So when you hear people talk about MBF, MBF stands for 1,000 board feet. So a buyer would offer, $350 for 1,000 board feet for all the timber on this 40 acres, and it's up to them to make money on that if they can get it done with appropriate costs. They also might just offer you a lump sum for all of the wood on that 40 acres, let's say, and you'd have to know if that's about the right amount. And then, of course, they take the risk of the market going up or down between the time they pay you and the time they actually log it and deliver the logs and get paid themselves. So that's what stumpage sales are all about. It's often a simple way to go. And then the mill sale would be that the landowner and their agents, like the forester and the logger, they all work together and deliver the logs and sell them to all the different mills and get paid for those logs. And so the money is coming from the mill, and it's up to the landowner and their agents to do a good job of delivering the logs the mill wants. And then that's how you ultimately get paid on the net scale, again, which is a measure of how much wood is in the logs. So, that is important to know, because then if you're getting ready to sell the wood, you've got to know, how that's going to be done, and locating and marking the boundaries of the area where you want the harvesting to be done. If it's going to be a thinning, or you've got selected trees, then you've got to decide, or your agent decides, which trees are going to be cut and which trees are going to be left. And then, of course, you don't want to damage the ones you leave when you're doing a thinning or selective harvest. So laying all that out so that it actually works out in the end, and it looks the way you think it ought to look when it's all done. Then there's the logistics of where do the trucks come and go? Is there room for the equipment to turn around? Where are they going to stack the logs? A landing is what we call that, a large area where logs are going to be stacked, ready to be loaded onto the trucks. And really important, of course, to know, again, your property lines and know which trees are yours, so you don't end up inadvertently taking someone else's trees and being hit with a timber trespass problem. So when it comes to finding buyers and services. Something else that I put in the references that I sent for this week, the Oregon Forest Industry Directory is one way. And this is an online directory that we keep working on. It started with Extension, is maintained by OSU Extension, and our fearless leader now for the Extension program, Scott Levengood. He actually has been the keeper of this and this Oregon Forest Industry Directory. And so I did assign you an exercise, if you felt like it, to actually try it out. We aren't experts at making online software and directories, and we kind of invented this and cobbled it together, but we keep trying to improve it. And it's a way to find people who buy logs or sell logs, people who can provide services you're looking for. And it's a growing directory, and the more the users keep it up to date, the better it is. So if you actually want to be on the directory and have a service or something to sell, then we can invite you to join it and keep it up to date as well. And hopefully some of you tried that out. And if you do try it and have questions, you can always email us, and I often use it and then extract a list and send it to people who ask me, to help find a forester or a logger or a log buyer, among other things. So another thing we're getting into here, which we're not diving too deep into, are these measures like board feet and things like that. And there's a lot of good publications that we have for you to teach yourself. We also often have workshops and classes at other events where we practice, measuring distances and directions and putting in plots and measuring how do you get trees per acre? How do you know the average diameter of the trees in your stand? How do you know the heights of the trees in your stand? And then, of course, the more advanced version is the amount of wood, the timber volume, the volume per acre, the volume in a tree, the volume in a log. So these are all aspects of measuring trees and the conventions and units that we use in forestry. I just used an example here of the way that logs are scaled. So when you sell logs to mills here in Oregon and most of the US, there's a scaling cylinder, and then so they, I talk about the small end diameter of a saw log, the smallest generally being 5 inches, and you have a 40-foot log with a 5-inch top, and they measure the cylinder. That's a 5-inch cylinder, 40 feet long, and that's the volume they get out of that log. Well, if that log is 16 inches on the butt, then there's a lot of wood in the lower part of the log that you're not getting, that's not measured, but the mills actually account for that, which gets a little bit deeper into the woods, or the weeds, I should say. But anyway, just know that this is an example of a measurement, and a key one, that we sell logs based on the small end diameter projected as a cylinder through the rest of that log. And then when it comes to finding a logger, the good ones are usually busy. Now, of course, sometimes during recessions or during slow times, then nobody's very busy. But right now, most loggers, the good ones especially, are quite busy. We have the ongoing normal planned green timber harvesting that's done in Oregon, and that more or less is about 4 billion board feet a year that gets harvested by all the different kinds of landowners out there, but a lot of course, are the large private industrial owners. But when you as a small woodland owner decide you want to sell, you're coming into this very busy marketplace. Right now, it's very busy because of that, and also the fire salvage, and now probably some of the ice damage salvage is going on. And then small jobs, again, small job being really anything less than 10 acres, but particularly less than 5 acres. It's harder to find operators that would cater to that kind of small job, but they are out there. And then it often takes more lead time. And this graph is actually before the current kind of situation we're in, 1 to 6 months. As I mentioned, when I was looking for a logger to do the kind of work I wanted to do, which was a thinning job, they were telling me a year out. And when I finally did find the one I, eventually got, I was still planning, 6 to 9 months ahead of when it actually happened. And they're usually very busy in the summer when it's dry, because a lot of us don't have good rock roads, and we don't want logging equipment on our soil when it's wet and can be damaged. So we'd like to log when it's dry. And of course, that's then the busiest logging season of the year, during the summer. And another one of the references we gave you, I mentioned, was, choosing the right service provider, contract logger. So this is just an example of the kinds of things that you need to look at. But, first and foremost, if you can get references, or you can do what Michael was talking about, where you can put them on probation and give them a trial, say, yeah, that worked, I'll hire you again. Or talking to your neighbor or others that can say, yeah, this logger did a good job for me, and more about their kinds of jobs that they're suited for. And then, of course, more of the details of their business, their proof of insurance. Always best when you don't, especially when you don't know the playing field, getting multiple bids, and definitely a written contract is important. And Brad will talk a bit more about that. Are some certifications. Oregon has Associated Oregon Loggers. There's a professional logger certification that gives you some idea. A lot of the good loggers have the pro logger certification, and they have to keep up with continuing education. And then you get down to some more of the nitty gritty of the kind of work you want them to do. Are they equipped to do that? If you want to do a thinning of small timber that's close together, do they have people and machinery that can work in that kind of environment? If you wanted to do selective harvesting of big trees, 150-foot trees, is this operator really experienced and skillful in that kind of falling and minimizing damage, et cetera? And then when you look at what's involved in the process and the costs and how those are figured out, you may have heard that someone says, well, to come log 2 acres, I can hardly afford to move my equipment in, or you can hardly afford to pay me to move my equipment in, because there's a fixed cost, and pretty common startup costs are $1,200 to $2,400 just to start the job, to get all the equipment there, pay the trucks that bring it in, and the time that it's sitting there before they get started. And then the variable costs, which is really where the some of the difficulty comes in, is what sort of falling and yarding and processing, how difficult is it, depending on your land and your access, and the way you mark your trees, how easy it is to do. And then what really adds up for a lot of us smaller landowners are, how much are we going to spend on the post-harvest slash treatments? That's not strictly speaking part of the logging, but it is often the best time to get it done, is when you have the operator there that finishes the job and now clean it up for me. And you can easily spend a whole lot of your profits tidying things up if you don't watch out. So you need to have a good idea what's involved there, and what you're going to do to treat that slash, and how far you want to go with it. And then the other specifications, especially for a lot of us, if you have special features, if there's buildings and fences and neighbors to accommodate and things that might complicate the job, those are all going to add up and affect the costs for harvesting. So just having a good understanding of that, and being able to weigh the bids that you get with that in mind. And I did mention contracts, and I think Brad, how much are you going to say about contracts? Are you back?
I am back. I'm not a whole lot, actually.
Okay. Well, then I'll be saying more than enough here. Just that's a key part of working with loggers and contractors, and there's a lot of basic things that you want to know in your contract. Now, strictly speaking, you could even have a verbal contract, as long as you know all these things and are confident. But of course, we advise that you have it all written down, because there's a lot of details to cover. Who's going to pay for the setup, and what's the basis of payment, et cetera. Making sure the logger is fully tuned in and aware of all the rules of the road, as well as your rules for what you want with that person on your land with these machines that could do some damage in a hurry. And then, of course, the termination, and what's going to happen, who's taking care of the road conditions, are they going to fix them after they're done, that kind of thing. And of course, the insurance, the liability, that's an essential part, making sure that that's specified, and that you are covered on the logger's insurance, and maybe vice versa, depending on the contract. So I'm not going to go too much more into that, but of course, if you're entering into some deal like this with a fair amount of money, and also liability and potential damage, that you want to be covered with a written contract. And then this topic of monitoring, and what we mean by that is just keeping an eye on things and seeing how it's going. Once you've started an operation, if you've hired a forester to watch it for you, that's good. Maybe that covers it, but it's always best for you to, you're the one who's left, with the, the damage or the quality of the work that's done. You're the one ultimately that's going to have to deal with the aftermath. So checking the progress, making sure that they're not breaking your rules of the contract and what you expect, addressing issues when they come up. And then it does help for you to know what the rules are with the Forest Practices Act, the FPA. While it's not, the logger is responsible, it should be in the contract that the logger is responsible. And if they violate rules and not under your direction, but they choose to do some things they shouldn't have, then they are held accountable. But you don't want that to happen anyway. So it's good for you to keep an eye on things. And taking lots of pictures can help. Just document how things were before and during and after to make clear, if you have issues that you want to address. And again, what's going to happen with your roads and the slash disposal. And that everything is taken care of before they leave. Like if possible, before they leave and those logs haven't been delivered to the mill yet. What are they doing there? They should have been delivered. And I think we mentioned this before in the Forest Practices Act and the illustrated manual that, again, I refer you to as your Bible as an easy way to read about some of these aspects. But when it comes to any kind of logging operation or operating powered machinery in the fire season, even just thinning or chemical application herbicides as part of your forestry operation, notification of operations, which now is through this electronic filing system called Ferns. And if you're not up to speed on that, you create an account and log in and use it, but you can also go to a Department of Forestry office and they'll help you do this at least the first time and get you in. And of course, the operation will trigger consideration for whether or not you need to have reforestation. There's the requirements for some minimum wildlife habitat if it's a large enough timber sale that you need to leave logs on the ground and some snags for wildlife. If there's any water and creeks involved, then of course the riparian buffers, which we talked about briefly. And if you have a large acreage, and there's a maximum size of clear cut that you'd have to be attentive to. And this part, with what you're going to do with slash. So slash is usually everything less than 3 inches in diameter. Sometimes there's a lot of stuff that's even bigger, chunks of wood, this and that didn't leave the woods. Some of that you could leave for habitat. We talked a bit about this in terms of fire prevention or fuels management, that, if there's bigger chunks that are left, they're good for habitat. And in terms of fuels, the bigger chunks in contact with the ground are less of an issue. But this slash is really the huge fire hazard and also an impediment to access. And so how you're going to deal with that? Lopping and scattering it, piling it and burning it, piling it, not burning it, chipping it, making biochar. There's a lot of different aspects to that. And if you're living near some of the larger cities in the Willamette Valley, the smoke management rules and the permitting are such that you may not be able to burn slash piles in the traditional way. So you really want to be tuned into what your options are for dealing with slash. And more we're looking at creative alternatives to the usual piling and burning, but piling and burning does still work in places where it's allowed. And again, the conditions of the road. And if you have roads or trails on steep slopes, it's your responsibility to make sure that they don't cause erosion. So there's requirements there. The forest practices forester or the stewardship forester who enforces forest practice rules will point things like that out to you if you have potential that your roads might cause erosion, in which case you put in things like water bars to divert water before it can cause erosion. So with that, that's the brief version of some of the key aspects of harvesting that just kind of make you aware of those things, and then know that you probably need to study it more if you're planning to do a harvest operation. And this is the part that I just wanted to give you some examples. Since I've been here in Clackamas County, I've been involved in 5 different timber sales, 4 of those on the Hopkins demonstration forest, and then 1 I did on my own property. So I was going to share an example. One of the sales that we did just as an example, was a small clear cut. And we had 40 to 60-year-old kind of a mixed forest. There was quite a bit of alder and maple mixed in, and then kind of a diverse scattering of Douglas fir and some cedar and a mix of ages in these different little patches, even within 5 acres. And it was across the creek, and it was an area where we had a road crossing, and we really wanted to get to that corner of our property. And the timber sale was going to help us, pay for that access, as well as we had a reason that we wanted to start over. It had so much alder and maple that it was 50, some of the alder and maple was 50 plus years old. And we wanted a place to replant Douglas fir and cedar, reduce the hardwoods that are going to be coming back, but not to be as much of a component as they were last time. Plus, at Hopkins, we like to have places to plant trees with for educational purposes. So that was our goal, and this is what the unit ended up looking like. It's interesting. It almost looks like somebody was making a work of art from this to seen from the sky, but that strip in the middle is a small non-fish bearing stream. We decided to leave a buffer of trees there. Mostly it was hardwood trees, but some cedars. And it was not required, but it was a nice little ravine that fed our main creek. And so we decided to buffer that. And then on either side, there's a couple of acres on either side was the area that we wanted to clear. You can actually even see the shovel. The machine is still out in the clear cut in this drone view. So at Hopkins, I work with another forester who has a lot of connections. So our advantage is that at Hopkins Demonstration Forest, we have a really knowledgeable, experienced forestry community. We have a forester with lots of experience as our executive director. And when we need a logger, we know who to call, and they work for us periodically. So we have confidence and trust in the logger. In this case, this is a father and son team that helped us out for a local group. And they did a nice job. They used the shovel, basically this one here that's out piling slash actually was put to work, and then they had a log loader and they had a skidder. And when they use that shovel out in the unit, it crawls around on top of slash and things, so it's not doing a lot of soil damage. But you can see, and after all the last log truck left, that this unit had a lot of slash because a lot of the smaller hardwood pieces and tops and things, pretty high levels of slash. And so then we spent about $2,600 on this slash piling operation, burn the piles. And then on the lower right, 3 years out after we planted it, we have a new planting of Doug fir and cedar on the way. And then I'm going to share a different type of sale, one that may be common for a lot of us. I have 13 acres of woodlands. It was actually an old horse pasture that was planted back in 1980. And at the time in 2016, I'd actually been meaning to thin it for years. And then it kind of was too scary to think of thinning it when it was 20 to 25 because there wasn't enough merchantable timber, and also it was already looking too dense. I was worried I had kind of missed my chance. It was 20 years old when I bought it. But then as it grew up, it started to thin itself and differentiate. And the squirrels actually helped me thin it out too, chewing on the cambium and killing, some of the trees. So it ended up being about 200 trees per acre, 14-inch diameter. If you look at our diagram, though, that was in the danger zone as far as density goes, meaning the trees were going to be fairly tall and skinny, but still some of them had pretty good crowns. And I estimated I had 30,000 board feet per acre in this plantation on an old horse pasture. So the goal I had was to generate some income, improve the stand for the future. I really wanted to thin it. I didn't want to clear cut it, and I didn't want to wait. At that time, I was actually thinking of selling the property, and it was a way to take some of the money out, but also leave a nice forest for the future. And also wasn't sure if I would sell it, so I wanted it for me just in case as well, which actually has turned out to be the case. I still own it. So this is what it looks like. This was a 16-acre parcel. It had a home in the middle of it, has a home in the middle of it, and it had this plantation in the horse pasture and a little bit of older forest up on the edge. It used to be part of a bigger forest, but you can see in the neighborhood that there's a lot of forest management going on. And all of my neighbors generally choose to clear cut when they're cutting timber. But I was sticking to my guns, and I came up with this plan to thin most of the area here. Up here on this top corner was the southwest side, and well, it was going to protect me from the south and southeast winds, and I wanted to leave that as a buffer because I didn't want the wind to come and get into the rest of my thinning. And I wanted to clear cut a little area here to daylight the house and improve gardening and orchard options as well as the view. So everyone kept telling me, this is what took me almost 3 years to find a logger, because no one wanted to thin it, and they were a year or two out. And most of my forester friends were saying, don't bother to thin it, just wait 10 years and clear cut it. And I said, well, that's not what I want to do. So, and I was a little nervous about whether thinning would work anyway in terms of the hazard of these trees being a little too tall and subject to a wind after I thin. But after looking at it with this logger, we decided we thought it was worth a try. So we set about to do it. And turned out the logger I found was someone I got to know up here from working in the business up here. And they were going to be down in that area, and they brought in this nice little processor machine. You can see here a cut to length, medium-sized cut to length machine, and they thought they could work that out. This is what it looks like in action. And so they got to work thinning my property. They had a rubber tired skidder for moving the logs that the processor piled up out in the woods. And that skidder then was running over on top of the slash. And it was done in the summer, in August and September. And then the log loader, and I needed a good sized landing, which was actually my little clear cut that I put in to daylight the house. So that's how I worked that out. So it worked pretty well. They also brought this nice little machine, this little brush buster. The father really liked running this while his son ran the processor. And I had some blackberries and brush I wanted taken care of and roadside clearing. And he did a nice job with this thing, $90 an hour. But it only took him half a day to do what I wanted to do. So that's something to keep in mind. It's got a nice little brush chopper on the end that can take down anything to like a 6-inch diameter tree if he needs to. So this is what it looked like before I thinned the 200 trees per acre. This seems probably higher than that, but on average it was about 200. And in the middle of the operation, the cut to length work, they were moving through the woods and of course needed to protect my trees I was leaving behind so they didn't damage them too much, and did a pretty good job of that. And then when they were done and cleaned everything up, this is what it looked like. And I thinned it pretty heavily, and so I was kind of concerned about the stability. From 200 down to about 115 trees per acre. That brought the diameter up because I was taking the smaller trees, thin less than half the volume. The little clear cut, I had slash files to burn. And then I ended up with a whole lot of firewood, about 20 cords worth, because nobody wanted to take the 5 inches and smaller and some of the chunks that were left from defective trees. So that was another part of it. And this is what it looks like at the edge looking in. You can see why I was a little nervous about those trees being exposed to weather, but I've only lost 30 trees out of about 1,500 so far in 5 years. And this is just something to take home when you think about logging and what it might cost. I won't dwell on this too much, but the costs for logging in these examples, the clear cut was the least expensive, $191 per 1,000 board feet delivered to the mills. And then the thinnings, they would put another thinning in here that was comparable to mine, $240 a 1,000 board feet. But with the log values averaging over 600 a 1,000, then it made money. And the actual, if a logger says they'll charge you a percentage, you often hear 50-50 as a starting point. Knowing the numbers and getting the right answer is important. As you see in that clear cut, 30% was the right number for the cost to the logger. In my example, it was 38%. So these are the kinds of things you want to have a good handle on, knowing what you have and entering into a timber set. So that's it. So a lot of this is just to help you figure out what your expectations might be and what you need to do if you're thinking of doing any harvesting. And I'm done with my part of that show. I want to open it up for questions. And this time, since we're all here together, if you could, once somebody speaks up, we'll try to do it one at a time. And you can also put things in the chat. And then Brad, if you wouldn't mind Well, actually, Amanda, if you wouldn't mind maybe monitoring the chat, and then Brad and I can hopefully both answer questions as they come up.
I can do that.
Thanks, Amanda. So who has a question? I think I'll stop sharing so I can see everybody too. There we go.
My question is on what sort of capital equipment did you have on a daily basis as opposed to, leasing or hiring it out?
So you mean in my timber sale?
Right. Or
Yeah,
in general.
any of them. These were all about the same. In this case, these were mill sales, meaning that as a landowner and a forester, we hired all the work done. So we hired a logger. I called the mills, or my representative called the mills to find out what the prices were. We got purchase orders. So once I had a contract with the logger, and he quoted me a price that $240 a thousand was the average cost. He quoted me a different price for each mill that he delivered to because of the hauling costs to the different mills. But once the contract was signed, the logger took care of all that equipment and those costs. And if they got it wrong, when they sign a contract and quote a price, if the job is a lot harder than they thought and they spend more time and their equipment spends more time, they're the ones that absorb that cost. So once I had a contract with a cost per 1,000 board feet, it was up to them to deliver those logs at that cost, and that's all they charged me. So I didn't have any day-to-day. It was just as each load is delivered and I get a receipt from the mill, a ticket from the mill, then I owe the logger the money for that load. And that's how that worked in my case, and in all the cases of what we just did. I just showed you.
I guess to clarify that, could you explain what equipment that you would have on a daily basis on your property to do whatever management that you would need to do in your woodlands? This would be before the harvest even.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Yeah. So the logger had all the equipment needed, including the fire protection equipment, et cetera. Well, for me as the owner and the forester, I'm pretty light. I mean, my equipment, I actually hadn't done a lot other than maintaining the roads and the trails and some weed management and brush management. I bought the trees when they were 20 years old. So it was really well established. And since I didn't choose to thin it or do any work myself, like pre-commercial thing with a chainsaw, I did very little other than as a forester, I went out and did the cruising part where I measured the trees and came with that estimate of 30,000 board feet per acre. But really for walking with the logger, I didn't even need to do that. I could have gone out with this logger because they told me how much I had, and it pretty much matched what I had estimated. But that only worked because it was a very experienced logger that I trusted. If you didn't know any better, you definitely would like to have your own numbers. But so mostly I did was just kind of knowing what I had and just taking care of it around the edges, and then hiring a logger to do the real work.
Thank you.
I should say I have a lot more work to do now with tree planting and continuing to clean up slash and those 20 cords of firewood, and other things I want to do to diversify the understory. In this stand, as you saw, it didn't have a lot of diversity, so I'm planting some things and encouraging things. Okay, I think that yes.
There's a question about insurance. Naomi asks, what type of insurance do you need as a private landowner?
So in the case of this logging job, I required the logger to have all the insurance, the liability for anything related to the logging. Now, as a landowner, woodland owners, you can get different kinds of liability insurance. You kind of assess what you think your risks are. In my case, I can buy insurance through the Oregon Small Woodlands Association as a member, which covers it's fire insurance was the main thing. There's other kinds of insurance if you're really in the business, but all I had was my homeowner's insurance and my woodland owner's insurance for fire is all that I had. And that fire insurance basically covers you for up to $300,000, which is the state maximum a landowner would pay for a fire that starts as part of activities that I hired and have done. Now the logger also had liability for fire in this case, but let's say I lit the slash piles on fire, that was my responsibility. And if I did everything right and had the right permits and the fire gets away, then I'm only subject to the first $300,000 of cost. If I was negligent or broke the law, then my insurance won't help me beyond that $300,000. But you can buy the insurance to cover that first $300,000 when you're doing everything right and you still have a fire. So, but that's getting a little into the weeds, but that's something that you should study up on. And you can actually, through the Oregon Small Woodlands Association, they make it easier for you to get this kind of insurance. It's very important to have with relation to fire.
And Glenn?
Yeah.
I'm not real familiar with this, but I understand from some of the landowners I work with that you can also talk to the operator and get them to add some additional insurance coverage to their program that you can pay for. Right.
And a lot of that comes down to assessing what you think the risks are. Right. And so the normal risks, so the logger I hired, he had his insurance. I knew how much he was insured for. And he gave me a binder that showed that I was then on his insurance for the job. And I think there are some more questions in the chat as well.
Joe's question is, how do you find out more about the Master Woodland Manager program?
All right, well, I'm glad you asked. Actually, Brad and I are discussing the Master Woodland Manager program. Is your question because you would like to become a Master Woodland Manager, or you would like to meet one?
I'd like to learn more about what's involved in becoming one.
Okay, very good. So first, this class is kind of a starting point. Master Woodland Manager trainees, we usually like for you to have this basic forestry course as a prerequisite, or just a lot of experience in lieu of this, or going to tree school for 10 years, taking lots of other classes. So then given that and your interest in learning and your interest in volunteering, because volunteer service is part of being a Master Woodland Manager. And normally our course, we're actually planning this course. They haven't set the dates, but we're thinking of starting it in August and going through November and having about every 2 weeks a session, maybe with a skip somewhere in there. So it's usually like a series of 8 sessions. We like to do mostly field education, maybe with an hour of indoor education, to begin a day, but then go out in the field for 6 hours. I usually like to have kind of an integrated interdisciplinary forester and a wildlife biologist, a forest health person and a fire person, et cetera. So yeah, it would be that training. 70, 80 hours is what we target. And then we'd like to have that much volunteer service back from you after you become a Master Woodland Manager. And then there's a lot of different ways you can volunteer, but stay tuned for that. If you're interested, we're definitely going to advertise it once we get this set. We're on the edge of our seat about back to in-person education with COVID. And we think that by August, and it being outdoor focused, that we could probably do this starting in August. And you will all be on my list as candidates in case you're interested, because you are taking this class. And Brad and I will probably team up on this one.
The last question we have in the chat right now is from Charles, and Charles asks if there's a list. Actually, Charles has 2 questions. Is there a list of mills in the northern part of the valley?
Yes, so that now you can always call a knowledgeable person about who the mills are, and I could tell you, but I also would refer you to the Oregon Forest Industry Directory, because it actually has that utility that you search it and look for mills and what are you selling and who's buying. So in terms of mainstream mills, for example, right here in Clackamas County, we have 2. One is a smaller log mill called Interfor in Molalla, and the other is a more medium, kind of 8 inch and up mill called RSG. And those 2 mills are both quite viable in buying. But there's also lots of other types of mills. For example, there's smaller portable mills. People even have mills come to their land and saw lumber out of their trees. There's small mills that you can take your logs to that take, you know, even a dump truck load or a trailer load, and they will custom mill lumber for you. And they also buy logs. Like near me, there's one, a third mill in the Malala area called Caster's Custom Cutting, and he's definitely looking for cedar logs and high quality Doug fir logs, and he will custom cut hardwood logs. So if you look in the Oregon Forest Industry Directory, you'll actually find dozens of mills in the North Willamette Valley when you start looking. Any other second question from Charles?
Yeah, Charles found a second question is, how much per acre should a cruiser cost?
It's a little tough. They don't often do it per acre. They'll generally look at the job and they'll either do it by the job or by the day. And then, you know, so if you had only 5 acres, you know, you probably have a higher cost per acre for the cruiser to show up and cruise it. If you had 40 acres and over 40, then you'd probably get a day rate or a quote. Cruisers that I've hired and worked with are $500 a day is a pretty common charge. And we just had the Hopkins Demonstration Forest cruise 140 acres, and 5 cruisers did it in about, I think 2 days. So, you know, it's pretty common to get it, you know, well, I should just leave it at that. So you have to get quotes from the cruisers and get more than one if you can.
Are they in the Forest Industry Directory as well?
Yes, yes. And also, in addition to the Forest Industry Directory is a good place to go to find timber cruisers. In fact, in the email I sent you, I set up an exercise where you wanted to find a service provider. And once you learn to use that search utility under services, and then timber cruising would be one of the services. Appraisal, there's a little difference between appraisal and cruising. So cruising just gives you an estimate of volume per acre, usually by species, but a cruise can be fairly general and rough, whereas an appraisal, they break it down to how much would you net if you were to sell this timber, you know, today, and they'd have to break down all the species and log grades and the logging cost estimates and the access, and they'd factor all that into it and say, here's what I think you'd make if you sold it. So an appraisal is much more involved than a cruise. But the cruise is the basis of an appraisal. You need to start by knowing how much wood are the different types, and then know the markets for that to get the actual dollars.
I'm trying to turn 5 acres back into pasture. Basically, that's what I'm trying to do with 40-year-old Doug fir.
Yeah. And is it pretty well, is it really full of trees?
I got 192 trees on the 5 acres.
Okay. Is there much daylight on the ground? Or is there a lot of brush underneath?
No, there's not, because we've limbed it up and burnt the limbs over the years.
Okay. Well,
And,
anyway, that's,
my
I know,
neighbor-
you would want to cruise to find out, but 5 acres, you could have a substantial amount of timber. I mean, like, for example, my young stand, which was full of trees, you know, 30,000 board feet per acre, you know, times 5 acres. So, you know, 150,000 board feet, that's a pretty substantial amount. The dollar figure I had in that example, even if you'd clear cut it, you would have made more. You know, often you can make close to $400 to $500 per thousand when the market's right. So that would be, you know, that would translate to a significant amount of money. So yes, 5 acres can definitely be, you know, worthwhile, and you definitely want an accurate estimate of what you have.
So you'd start with the cruiser and then go to the appraiser? They 2 different people?
No, usually if you know you want an appraisal, you probably just hire a forester to do an appraisal. But a cruiser can pretty much translate that to, it depends on how you're going to sell it. So if you have a cruise, and let's say it said you had 100,000 board feet of wood, and you call the log buyer and they say, okay, here's what we're paying. The next question is the logging costs. And well, if you talk to that forester or logger, then you'd find out what the logging cost is, and then you would know the value. So you could take a cruise, and then you get a good estimate from a logger or forester of the logging costs, and then you would have your appraisal basically from that. There's other little nuances. I mean, there's also, you know, usually some risk that goes in there but just for you to decide to get this done, a cruise is a great starting point, and then deciding on the logger is the next key point, or whether you're going to hire a forester to help you work with the logger, and they would help you get that bottom line and decide how to go about it. And if your goal is to convert to that pasture anyway, you just want to make sure you get the right amount. It's not like you need to know exactly what it is, unlike if you're selling it to someone else when you need to know closer to exactly what it is. As long as you knew you were going to, you know, it would work out, then that might be adequate for you just to proceed with a good idea of that without knowing exactly how much it is. Just that it's going to work, it's going to make money, and you'll get the market rate.
Well, since the goal is pasture, I'm not really too concerned on how much I would get out of it at the end, because I'm not going anywhere as far as the property is concerned. We live on the property. You see what I mean?
Yeah, well, all the more reason you probably don't need an appraisal. You just need to work out how it's going to get done and make sure you do get the right, a good rate for it. But if you have a really well-stocked 5 acres, you know, who's going to say no to $75,000 or whatever? You know? So if it added up to that much, I mean, that's what mine added up to. So it's, you know, it can be significant. Other questions?
Yeah, there's one left in the chat right now from Dorothy asking, how long can trees be on the ground to be considered fresh green?
That's a good question. You know, the strict definition of fresh green means that when you bark it, it still has fresh looking sap in there, and it has some, if there's any branches left, they're still green. So usually that's like within a month or so. But if the real question is, have the logs deteriorated? So the mills always will generally say we want fresh green logs. But if you say, well, maybe if you don't say anything, but the first load comes in, if they're not fresh enough, then they'll say, hey, these aren't fresh logs. But if you cut logs in the winter and the temperatures are low, they stay green longer. If they sit out all summer long, they start end checking. And then within a year, you'll start to see signs of sap rot. So the logs will go through these pretty obvious stages of deterioration, and the buyers are going to be knowledgeable of that. So they can be fresh and green, maybe even they can look pretty fresh in 3 months in the wintertime. But in the summertime, they'll change a lot quicker. I don't know if anyone else has anything to add to that. Anybody had experience selling logs that have been sitting around for a while? I know, for example, I work with the OSU College Forests. I'm fortunate to have a little satellite forest called Ramsdell here in Clackamas County, and some of our other extension agents have neighborhood forests. So Ramsdell is another 140 acres. There was a lot of blowdown at the edge of a harvest unit that the College Forest had done, and we do education and we cooperate on this college forest here nearby. So anyway, there was blowdown, and it sat there for almost 2 years. It was a really nice Douglas fir at the edge of a unit that had some root rot, and the wind got into this stand at the edge of a harvest. It blew down 50 big trees. And I kept calling and saying, when are we going to get those trees? And even though we didn't get them for 2 years, it was only the outer, you know, 2 inches or so of those logs, the sapwood, that had deteriorated. And so then they deducted that and deducted, you know, a few inches of diameter, and we got paid for the heartwood of those logs. So it wasn't a complete loss. But here, you know, with the fire salvage and with the windstorm damage, you should expect to be able to sell these trees, you know, next year. But when it gets towards 2 years, and depending on how hungry the mills are, then that can change. But strictly speaking, if there's sound wood, you can sell it. And so it's a matter of how it really has deteriorated or not. Are there more questions?
This is a steep learning curve.
Well, and really, that's why I said, you know, just this tonight is really it's an awareness event tonight, you know, that you get an idea of what all the issues and aspects of selling timber are or could be, and then where do you need to learn more. I might I put someone else on the spot, Michael, since you had this experience of selling several timber sales, how did the learning curve go for you? When did you feel you know, confident in your ability to negotiate. Oh, maybe Michael didn't hear me.
Okay. Took me a moment to get unmuted. I guess I had the easy way out. Basically, the logger did most of the things you've described. He decided where to sell the wood. And well, one thing I learned, I mentioned the original logger was a family friend of my parents. And he basically wanted to be paid a certain amount, let's say per 100 board feet. And in some of the timber sales, he made over half of the money. And I just assumed that's the way everybody did it. But when the new logger came on, the one that my brothers and I found, he wanted to do it by a percentage. And so I was immediately suspicious that that was not so good. But then he pointed out that it was in his best interest to find the highest value place to sell the logs. Whereas the original guy just sold everything to GP in Philomath. The new person sold some to Murphy's, he sold some to Weyerhaeuser, and somewhere else, I can't think where else, oh, GP. And so he shopped around for each different size log for the very best price that he could get. So I guess I've become a fan of the percentage thing, because if you're going to have the logger kind of do a lot of, well, I guess you could call the forester work for you, because he then has an economic incentive to get you the best possible price. But you're probably looking and saying, boy, that guy is really naive as to how all this happened. But I guess we were lucky we found a good logger who didn't take advantage of us. We were naive.
Yeah, well, yeah, and that really covers a lot of the spectrum there. And so yes, it comes down to, if you find a good logger, they can really do a lot for you, and they can handle all those things. But you really want to be educated enough to kind of know when you have found a good logger. You know, even if everything seems to go well, you still kind of like to know that you've got the right price. So you saw in my example, so we sold all our own logs. We got the purchase orders, and we shopped around. The foresters do that work. So when you have the logger do that work, it's true then that if they have a fixed rate, usually per 1,000 board feet, and you saw the rates that I had from a low of 190 to a high of $240 per 1,000 to deliver the logs. And those are kind of ballpark what you'd expect as a small landowner. Industry would probably get it done a little cheaper because they're higher volume, and plus they drive a hard bargain. And the loggers know they're going to get a lot of work year after year from those large owners. So anyway, in our case, you know, the actual percentage that turned out to be right ranged from 30 to 38% to the logger. And that's all very dependent. You know, that percentage really depends on log prices. So when Doug Fir is selling for $800 a 1,000, and the right logging price is $200 a 1,000, which is not, you know, that one that we had was 190. So let's say $200 a 1,000 is the right price for logging under these conditions to deliver those logs to this mill, and that mill is paying 800, then the logger should get 200 and you should get 600. But if that mill is only paying 500, which could happen in a bad year, the logger still gets their 200, their job still is the same. And then you're only going to make 300. So there's a, you know, 100% difference in the amount a landowner would get, and a huge difference in the right percentage just based on the market price. So that's why a lot of professionals would just say, I'm going to hire the people at the proper rate, and I'm going to market the logs myself and get the best market. And that takes the logger out of that part of the deal. So that's, and it certainly, there's advantages to the percentage when it's the right percentage or close enough. The logger will do the work for you once you've settled about the right percentage, but you kind of need to know what the log market is like before you settle on that. I mean, worst case scenario, cedar was selling for, you know, $1,900 per 1,000 board feet this last year. Okay, and the logging cost $200, and the cedar sells for 1,900. You sure don't want a 50% deal with the logger in that case. You need to know the right ballpark.
But we didn't have any cedar, so we lucked out.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it sounds like you did well, and you learned a good way, and you came out all right in the various ways you did it. And so hopefully that helps people get an idea. The learning curve, hiring a skilled professional is one way to skip a lot of the learning curve. And it's good for you to learn enough to know how to hire the right professional and to speak the language a little bit and be reassured that you've got a good professional and that, you understand what they're going to do. And then let that forester work with the loggers and the log purchasers and the burning and the planting and and a lot of those things, and even monitoring the sale for you. And so a typical consultant might charge you 5 to 10% to do all that. And they can often be quite worth the fee when they take care of all that for you and get a good logger and get the right price, et cetera.
The thing I would be intimidated about if I took on some of that myself is obviously the logs have to be sorted in some manner to know which go to which mills. Like I think Murphy's was capable of doing big logs. They may have that goofed up, but if the logger is doing all the logging, and then how are the logs going to be sorted to decide which ones go to which of the mills and how many you have for each mill? And basically the logger just took care of all that and we didn't have to worry about it, which was good for us because we aren't very skilled.
Yeah, no, that's right. Again, that's where the professional comes in, and that's where your timber crews and appraisal would have gotten at that if you needed it. But the other way to get that is just to know that your agent is going to get you the right price for whatever comes out of the woods. And so hiring an agent that can do that for you, skips a lot of that stuff. But Brad, I think.
So is it?
Oh, go ahead.
I got a quick question. So, what is an agent? What are they called? Are they called foresters in the forest directory, or
a consulting?
If you're looking at the list.
A consulting forester. Yeah, I mean, I use agent as in a general term. You hire someone to be your agent. So the logger could be your agent with the sawmill, for example. But I'm talking about hiring a consulting forester who knows all of these aspects, that whole list of steps in a timber sale and how to do that right. You could hire a consulting forester that would know all of that and be your agent, working with all the other contractors.
Is 5 acres worth it? I guess if you got, if you're starting from scratch, you know what I mean?
Yeah, it could be. It could definitely be. They might charge a slightly higher commission rate because a lot of the jobs are the same. I mean, they have to do the same thing to market, 20 truckloads that they'd have to market 200 truckloads as far as calling and getting a purchase order. And but the cruising of 5 acres is a lot simpler than cruising 500, obviously. So yeah, it could definitely be worth it, especially if you don't want to try to learn all these things and you're not comfortable hiring a logger yourself. Then hiring a forester to do it for you could be the way to go.
Yeah, I wanted to weigh in. I had a sense there that it wasn't that Glenn's terms were not necessarily being, talking about the agent, that he was referring to consulting foresters. And, can have a million different points where loggers will say, I can do everything that a consulting forester will. And Glenn has been talking about that. An advantage of having the consulting forester, though, is there's a second person who is operating on your behalf. And as the logger might, but then there's that, how do you split it up so that it's fair? Working with consulting foresters has other advantages because you may be having trouble getting access and finding people like loggers, especially if you have a small job. And you engage a consulting forester, and as Glenn was saying, the larger timber companies often have an advantage, especially when prices are good, because they are a continual source of business for the operators, the different types of operators. And it might be hard if you have 1 5-acre harvest to get their attention, but the consulting foresters, like the fellow who's on the board at Hopkins Tree Farm, has been in the business. They also represent a continual line of employment. And so it often has an advantage to you in moving up in line, that higher than you would if you are showing up once with 5 acres. So you can, you're getting the advantage of this person's career experience and role in the community and in the forestry community doing it. So there are a number of advantages. There is a cost. I haven't broken it down, but many would argue that they often, the better prices and so forth, or the more timely operations that they're able to get done, offsets that. So you're going to have to do that. This was a topic that, Glenn has a lot more experience than I do, but it's a very difficult one to cover in, Glenn's assignment, self-assignment, team assignment today was to give an introduction to this, because so that a person can start thinking about it and weighing, knowing what some of the options are. But we've had, 2-day and longer workshops on this where we start going into the details. We give you examples of purchase orders and contracts, and have panelists of loggers to talk about how they like to operate. We had one up at Hopkins 2 or 3 years ago that was terrific. And in 2.5 days, it still felt a bit like a groundbreaker. We hadn't thoroughly exhausted the topic. But I think Glenn did a terrific job, gave you a good idea. We can't possibly answer all the questions because it takes some time, but there is a good set of resources there to look into, and certainly reading all the things on those reference pages just to be aware of what the options are is really the first step.
Yep, and we can help. We have the Oregon Forest Industry Directory. We also have lists of consulting foresters, and I definitely invite you all to correspond with us. Brad and I both with more questions down the road, and we can send you more things. So if the resources we already haven't sent you, you have more questions, just, get back in touch with us and we'll keep the conversation going. I think with that, I should probably turn it over to Brad, and then we'll have more questions before we're over, I expect. So unless there's any final questions on this before we go.
I wanted to just say really quickly, I went to the Oregon Small Woodlands Association mini tour out at Camp Whispering Winds a few weeks ago, and Matt Fehrenbacher from Trout Mountain Forest Consulting led that tour. And I have to say, I was really impressed with how the Girl Scouts own that camp, and I want to say it's about 240 acres. And they did some oak savanna restoration, or oak, I think they called it oak prairie restoration. And then he took us on a tour of some mixed age and mixed wood stands that they had. And I was really impressed with how, by what the Girl Scouts have accomplished by hiring a consulting forester, they were able to do really interesting and unique things. And one of the questions that came up from a lot of the woodland owners was, do you have a lot of trouble finding a logger who will come do these crazy little piecemeal projects, and he said, absolutely not, because, we've got this network of people who we trust and who we provide work to. And so they come through for us, whatever we want them to do. And for me as a landowner, I thought that was really interesting, because one of the things that I feel like always limits us is like, oh gosh, can we convince the logger to do this funky little project that we want to do, and to some extent, having that professional forester who doesn't have the angle of also being the logger, but then also has those resources of those professionals available to them. That I thought was really interesting. And I think for a lot of small woodland owners, that's a huge, huge benefit to have somebody who has that kind of power of having those resources to help you make your little dreams come true, even if they're funky little things that might not be that popular,
All right, thank you for that. That's
Very
great.
well put, Sarah. I'm glad we were recording that. That was just about the perfect testimonial. No, I think that is one of the advantages for small woodland owners, is trying to get people's attention at times, and who are good qualified people. And that is one of the stronger advantages, even separate from price things, is getting
Yeah.
people who will do the job the way you want it done. And that's part of the definition of a good logger, and also, or a good operator of whatever type. And also, it comes down to good communication. And as a layperson, not every landowner is familiar with all the options or all the terminology. And working with the consulting forester, they can help interpret and translate that for you and represent that, if you spent the time with them, and someone has to be a good listener, and hopefully it's either the logger and or your consulting forester. But that also, it's often comes down to a communication thing, and they have the language, and especially if they have that track record of those, that group of people who they turn to. They employ multiple people, but I'm sure they often have, people they prefer in certain, or their equipment according to their skills or equipment that are suitable for different jobs. So, that they know that, and you as a landowner may not automatically. So that is probably one of the stronger justifications for many landowners, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Hey, Brad, a couple more questions came up about this, so I'll just hit those real quick and then turn it over to you. Kind of related. One is, if you solicit bids, where to advertise, and then how do you keep tabs on market prices of logs? So advertising bids, actually, I've never done that specifically, but that's what usually larger owners might do. They know there's a bunch of log buyers out there and they're looking for wood. And so you might call the log buyer, and not only do you call them to say, hey, what are your prices this month? You say, I have X amount of wood to sell. Are you interested? And I'm going to call your competitor and ask them the same question. So, but there are formal bids that go out, and when you've got a portfolio, and that's a more advanced way to sell your logs, especially when you get into larger timber sales in a hot market, that the mills are competing for it. The kind of the usual way that a forester does it in a sort of typical situation is we just call all the log buyers, and they basically give us their bid right there, right? They say, I tell them what I think I have, and they tell me what they'll pay for it. And that's the bid right there. And then I call the other log buyer and ask them the same question, and I get another bid. So that's kind of the informal bidding and the Oregon Forest Industry Directory has the log buyers contacts, and they usually keep those up to date for the mills that buy all these different types of wood that we might want to sell. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Brad.
So we've actually covered an awful lot of the things that Glenn and I had thought about wanting to include in this. And so, but I think that's all very fruitful. I was going to start out as I often talk to people about this, I go back to some stories. And I remember, a number of years back when I was needing to write up an article about reforestation and so forth, I got in touch with one of my master woodland managers. This is Bob, and he is a landowner, was a landowner. He's passed away since, but he was in the Eola Hills, and he had spent his life working in agriculture and forestry, and had a 300-acre property where he raised some livestock, grew a bunch of trees, and a fair amount of Christmas trees. So he had just recently done an operation, a small clear cut. So I went to kind of talk to him about the process, get some story ideas for what the process would be that people would typically do when doing operations, and in this case, talking about reforestation and planting. And and it turned out really well. Bob just sort of walked through some of the things he did, like Glenn had. We weren't talking about the harvesting process so much, but Bob had always done his own harvesting up until about then. And at age 80 something, his son said, "No, Dad, we're going to hire the logger this time." And I'm sure Bob knew many of those guys, but I'm sure he was watching over them quite clearly. He was looking ahead in this, he was looking ahead to what he was going to do next and what he wanted to have come out of it. So separate from the discussion of pricing and so forth, he was also having conversations with the logger about what he wanted it to look like afterwards. So he made sure before the guy ever left, before the equipment left the ground, he had a bunch of firewood put into decks for he and his family and friends to collect, and they had piled the slash, the excess glass. The site had been cleaned up enough and the excess slash piled so that Bob later burned it. So here in January or whenever I visited, the site was pretty much ready to go. And then Bob had his trees ordered and a logging planting crew already lined up. And so we were talking about how do you get these jobs done well. Contracts are certainly part of it, but Bob was wanting to really just talk about how the important thing is to come up with a good contractor, in this case for planting trees or perhaps for sprayer. And as he said, someone with experience and a record of success that they can demonstrate. So he wants to be able to see some of their work, go back and look at somebody else's job or a job that they have done for someone else, and know that he's getting someone who he thinks is capable of doing the job. And then he says, then you want to definitely be sure to oversee their work. In the case of the planters, he says, I'd get out there and spend the whole first day with them. And then I'd go back out and spend a little time with them each day after. That gives you a chance to be taking a look at what they do. He would go out and he would walk behind across the whole planting crew to see that they were doing the job that he had asked for, that they were planting at the approximate spacing that they had talked about. He'd dig up trees from each of the planters to see that they were planted correctly, the right depth, not J-rooted, etc. And if he was seeing problems, he'd be talking to the crew leader about it. So the main thing he wanted to convey in this process to them, but also to the landowners that we were talking to through this article, was it's important to show that you care about the job. You want to see that it's done right. And you kind of get the feeling that that's true if you're hiring people, but what happens if your planting crew is all family, Bob? And you say, well, it's the same thing. First, you got to begin. I mean, if they're adults, you begin with explaining what the process is, how you want the work done, and demonstrating how it's done correctly, and working with them to develop the skills. And certainly, if it's your family, that's part of the outcome that you want as well, not just a clear area ready to, successful trees, but you want them to feel invested in the job. So that was sort of where I wanted to start with this. And I think we've had, through Glenn's experience with his logging crews, and then some of you other folks, as we've talked about, we've also heard some very clear examples, parallel stories about what your working relationships are with contractors of various sorts. Glenn sent some resources already that you hopefully reviewed, and the real workhorse for this is the Oregon Forest Directory, and he asked you to go through and do an exercise there. Did everyone? I'm going to put it on gallery, and everyone give me a thumbs up if you tried that exercise of going through and doing your assignment of trying to find the logs, the log buyers and stuff. So most of you did. It's a pretty cool site, really, in a lot of ways. And, we think of it, it was built for finding niche markets, but it works pretty well for finding contractors as well. A similar site in that it's an interactive site that I don't think Glenn included is also the Forest Seedling Network. Likewise, it was set up originally to sell a certain product, a way for people to get to sell excess or find someone else's excess seedlings, but it is searchable and can also give you, it's a way to get your lists of different people who you can contact and do your homework with. And what we've heard tonight from Glenn and the classmates and Bob Feldman, my MWM, was the importance of communication and talking to people about what it is that you want, and getting that clarified as you want to go through. The other thing that Glenn just mentioned briefly was regarding loggers specifically, would be the Associated Oregon Loggers, and they have a directory which is their pro logger directory, and this is a professional organization. This would represent not all loggers, but loggers who were a member of this group and had been certified to have received certain educational things. So it is one of the filters for this group of people, for if you're looking for loggers. The other process that I don't think Glenn talked about so much, I mean, when we often get calls, Glenn and I, about people who ask for recommendations. I mean, literally, they'll say, can you recommend a logger? And as I think we talked about earlier in the class, we, as state employees, public employees, that's not something we're allowed to do. And I no longer keep an active list for my area. It was constantly changing. I like these sites like the Oregon Forestry Industry Directory, because people put themselves on that, they update their own information, and that's useful. But then you end up with this list of people, and you need to sort through it. And there's a number of ways to do that. We're going to talk about another one in a moment, but word of mouth. Most of these loggers, when you talk to them, one of their main ways of finding business is word of mouth. Most of them pride themselves in the quality of their work, and they try hard to have a good reputation. And one of the better reasons to be a member of one of these organizations like the Oregon Small Woodlands Association or Oregon Tree Farm System is the chance to be part of this community of woodland owners, the chance, like Sarah took advantage of last weekend, to go out on some woodland tours, even under COVID, where I'm sure everyone was wearing their masks. We had pretty strict plans on that. And excuse me, gotta turn my phone off, and that's not working. Don't you hate it when people do that, huh? Forget to turn their phone off before class. So, so one of the advantages of being a member of one of these organizations is that gives you an opportunity through their meetings, through their workshops and tours, to talk to your neighbors who can give you rather candid information about their experiences, who they've worked with, how that has worked, lessons like Michael and Sarah were giving about some of the experiences they had, just things that they wish they thought about or that they needed to have clarified more. But that's one of the places that one of the mechanisms that you can use to sort through what some of your options are. And then, of course, Glenn also included this list of choosing the right service provider. This little series that we did, I think it's still 4-part. I was kind of thinking there was a 5th. Because we can't necessarily keep a complete list, and certainly not recommend people from that list, because we can't do that, one of the things we did do is try to come up with these sets of questions that were useful for a landowner to be able to, for a landowner or a future employer, is just what you would be, to know what the appropriate questions would be to ask these different types of service providers. We had a really good, really detailed discussion about what some of those questions would be for loggers, and they would be similar for some of the others, such as chemical applicators. You know, you're primarily going to be wanting to talk about what their qualifications are. What's the range of services that they would do? How the work would be done, the type of charge paying structure that we spend a lot of time on for loggers, by percentage or by 1,000 board feet. For these other types of consultants, it would be different. So we give you those sorts of things to facilitate your conversation after you've got your list from one of the websites, and then a few more recommendations pointing you somewhere from a neighbor or fellow member of the Small Woodland Association. And then finally, with this list of things, you could have this conversation of if they're going to be able to meet your specifications and your needs. So that was what I wanted to address here on that. And I think that was where we are. And I will stop sharing. Glenn, again, I think through his presentation, and then particularly after all the discussion and the sets of experiences you guys had, I think we've covered an awful lot of things that we wanted to talk about in engaging consultants or service providers in whatever sense. Communication, I think, is the clearest thing. Feeling comfortable that you have fully communicated with, that you're able to communicate clearly, that you show interest and make it clear that what you want, and that it's important to getting it done, as Bob talked about, I think is a key thing there. Glenn, we had wanted to kind of wind up a little early on this one to allow time. I think if anyone has other questions, I think we've handled this actually fairly thoroughly from what we wanted, but we often finish this class, or traditionally we'd finish this class with a day in the woods, a chance to kind of reach back and have other conversations about, where we try to tie the different pieces. We've been looking at these separate topics and themes as we've gone through, and our field trip at the end was usually a way where we could see all those things illustrated on one of our landowner properties and kind of tie the loose ends up. And so we were going to, we had proposed just opening up the mic at this point, allowing time first to deal with questions regarding this topic today, which I think we've handled well. So there may be questions that are a little too specific for us as far as individual projects on a property, but generally, Glenn, are you good to do 15 minutes of Q&A?
Yeah, let's have some more Q&A in general. And of course, if there's too much silence, I might have to offer more, educational advice. But let's start with any questions that you have.
I have a question. In the early 1980s, when my parents owned the property that we attempt to manage, it was in the Western Oregon Small Woodlot program, and they had an inspection by the state forester, and he identified an area that he wanted to have planted with Scotch pine. And so my parents did what he told them, and now those Scotch pine are getting reasonably large, but the logger tells me there isn't really much of a market for them, and that in fact, in the last 40 years, they now are considered a invasive species. What do you do with Scotch pine you got growing?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, one option is a specialty use. So if you go to the store and try to buy a 1x6 pine board right now, you know, you're going to pay an awful lot for it. So it does seem kind of odd that if you have pine trees that could make some nice pine boards, why couldn't you sell them? And the problem is they're just, our forest industry here is so geared up in a high volume business on the major species, and Scotch pine is not one of our major species. So you don't find too many mainstream mills to sell your pine to. And the one that you could sell it to might be a pulp mill that would grind it into chips and pay you, you know, $27 a ton for it. So another option you might have is what a lot of us people that really love trees and wood too much is we can't see it go to waste and we can't sell it for $27 a ton. So we find a mill and we make lumber out of it. And you know, that would be another option as a specialty route. It's often a lot of work and you're not necessarily likely to sell it. But it's true that there's not really a market locally for pine, even our Willamette Valley pine right locally. You kind of have to go pretty far south or pretty far into Eastern Oregon to find a pine mill. So that's, I'm sorry to say. And, you know, in the old days, both Extension and Department of Forestry in the earlier stages of our landowner assistance, you know, maybe things weren't quite as science-based or as appropriate as they should be. We hopefully we don't make those mistakes anymore, because planting something without knowing kind of what the expectations are ecologically as well as economically, you know, you want to be armed with better information than that. But
in fact, a logger told me that the state of Oregon, I don't know what part of it, will actually pay you money to get rid of them.
yeah, I'm not familiar with it going that far. I don't know, Brad, have you heard of anything like that about Scotch pine?
Not for Scotch pine. Scotch pine was, I had to step out for a minute to try to deal with that strange series of phone calls, but you know, they were often planted on very wet ground at the time. We've switched to ponderosa pine. Our valley ponderosa pine is what we would use in those situations. And I think that was also at a time when everyone was hoping to shoehorn trees into every inch of their property. Whereas if you were putting Scotch pine there, it was probably going on a space that was too wet. And today we might just say, well, you know, not all sites are really suitable for tree growth. But we do have a history where, and also people are creative and want to try different things. And so, you know, we've heard anywhere from eucalyptus to KMX pine. That's a tough one, and Scots pine. So
there was a lot of experimenting in the 80s, and I think we are more careful nowadays. So anyway, that's an interesting story, and I'm sorry that you're kind of stuck with that odd situation, but I would say, you know, what I mentioned, either the chip market or the specialty mill might be the way to go with that.
Thanks, I appreciate it.
Yes, go ahead.
Glenn, I'm curious, being new at woodland management, are there a lot of government regulations that are changing year to year, or are things pretty stable?
So the main
I'm talking
regulation,
either state or federal level.
well, I guess it depends on your perspective on it, but the Oregon Forest Practices rules and working through the Department of Forestry on those has been fairly stable. They are evolving, you know, based on, you know, as we learn more. But that's usually a well-known process and well advertised, and you can tune into where we're at. So fairly stable. You know, the federal regulations, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, some of those things that come in there. Actually, Oregon Department of Forestry provides the first filter for that, because their rules actually help you know whether you're going to run up against some of the water or the wildlife regulations as well. So it's relatively stable, but you know, we are in a time where those are being discussed and deals are being made, or, you know, more science is being done to shed light on the issue. So they will continue to evolve, but at any given time right now, you can find out where we stand and the rules that apply, for the foreseeable future until they are changed, and you'll have pretty good notice as to when they're changed.
Yeah, there are frequent minor changes. There was a fairly significant change, 3 or 4 years ago for
The
fish-bearing streams,
salmon, steelhead, and bull trout
salmon, steelhead,
rules.
and bull trout, and there, so there was a lot of discussion and preparation for that. That wasn't not a surprise. So they do try to be and are expected to be evidence-based, and there will be changes made in the future. We have
Thanks,
one or
Brad.
two questions here. Don is asking about level bottomland along the Pudding River. Is this floodplain harvestable outside of the 100-foot buffer? So that would be a large fish-bearing stream. I'm assuming that is a hardwood from what I know of the Pudding River. Glenn, that's your area now, but the Pudding River would be would not likely have a lot of conifer. It would be hardwood.
If it's a broad floodplain, I would expect it's probably mostly, cottonwood, ash, and maybe there's high spots that might have conifers. But and you would find out by going to the Department of Forestry, and they actually work with the Department of Fish and Wildlife to determine what, fish-bearing streams are, and then what they help you interpret where to draw the line for that 100-foot buffer. Sometimes that can be tricky if there's side channels or stream associated wetlands and things like that on some of this lowland. They can help you interpret, where the boundaries might be.
But yes, it would be allowed. It would be the definition of what that 100-foot is, which I think would be the sticking point.
All right. Any other questions?
A new extension podcast came out apparently that Joe is aware of before I am.
It started in October, apparently. My sister-in-law told me about it. It's fun. I've been enjoying it. It's good.
Great. Yeah, I'm glad you shared that. Yeah, and that should be the Into the Woods podcast.
Yeah, that's part of the Tiffany.
Yep. Yeah, actually, Amanda and I were looking for it, and actually, Jean just sent me something about that. No, that was about it. We have a tree school class, which is also called Into the Woods, so it gets a little confusing sometimes. But there is a podcast out, so we're dabbling in that as well in extension forestry. Brad and I actually got an email from someone, a member of this class, and I don't think she's here tonight, about large selling. Something you might hear often from loggers is that you can't let these trees get too big and too old because you won't be able to sell them. And a lot of, that's a concern that people hear a lot. And so, the answer or the discussion of that is that's not necessarily true. Douglas fir lives a long time. It can remain sound and healthy and vigorous for hundreds of years. And the larger it gets, the more of a specialty item it becomes. In our current marketplace is dominated by small logs and more of the, the 40 to 60 year age range tree farms. But if you have a large tree that has good quality, doesn't have overly large limbs, and then has high quality wood, there are still mills that are milling that. There are fewer and further between, but they often can pay the difference. And for example, I led a tour of the McMinnville watershed, and the forester managing that, they have a kind of an open-ended rotation, but they have many 100 to 150-year-old trees. And as they get older, they're managing them for high quality. And he has no problem selling his 3 to 4 foot diameter, high quality 150-year-old trees when the time came. So it's not necessarily true that big old trees are harder or impossible to sell, but you may have to shop harder. Now, if they do have a lot of rot and defect and decay, or if they are, have a lot of big, huge branches, like at the edge of an opening or on an old farm, and they've been beat up in the weather for a while, then yeah, that particular oversized tree may not be that easy to sell. But the key to that is knowing what you have. And if you can, if you're cultivating mature forests and doing selective harvesting of older trees, 80 to 100 years old, which we're doing at Hopkins Demonstration Forest right now, you just have to be really tuned into some of the what's a good quality tree and trying to manage the stand conditions to keep them in good shape. And they have some high value. So I just say you got to know what you have and know the market, but don't necessarily assume that as they get older and bigger that you won't be able to sell them, because that's
I don't think there's the price premium. There used to be a price premium that came with that, and that maybe doesn't exist quite as much, depending on its quality and so forth.
Well, because a 150-year-old tree is not the same as a 400-year-old tree. So that, you know, a 5-foot diameter 400-year-old tree, you can easily have a 4-foot diameter 150-year-old tree, and it's certainly not having the same kind of quality of wood that much older tree with the tight growth rings has. However, I mean, I've called the mills that buy those larger logs. Utility poles is one market for larger, taller trees. If you can get a 100-foot stick out of the woods, and then the custom mills that cut for grade, higher grade lumber, there are still several of those around, and they are paying top dollar. This person that was selling the wood from the McMinnville watershed, you know, he was getting about a $200 premium for his larger, nicer logs than he was getting for average, you know, run of the woods 50-year-old logs. So they're still out there, but in some cases you might be 200 miles from that mill, in which case then the distance to haul to that mill could then make your location less attractive. But here in the Willamette Valley, actually, there's a fair number of mills in range, either north or south, that often, you know, can buy those nicer quality logs. All right, well, I just want to offer that because we had that question that came by email, and we'll address that more. Well, thanks for all coming. Any more questions tonight before we close? I think we're about at quitting time. Yes, we are. So thank you all for coming, and please stay in touch with us. You know, if you give us enough time, you know, definitely like to get to know you better and maybe have a chance to visit your woodland. And stay tuned for the field day, because there will be more. Sarah mentioned that one where you went out on a field day with a forester. We're hoping to offer some of those this summer, and especially through your local woodland association chapters, hosting those field days, just like the one you mentioned, Sarah. So there'll be those coming up this summer.
And remember to join us the next few weeks for Wildfire Wednesdays for the Fireware Fire Prepared program, and share that information with friends and neighbors in town as well as in the country, because this is new reality that Western Oregonians need to internalize, like our friends and family in Central Oregon and other places have.
Excellent.
So,
all right, Amanda put the advertisement up again, so that's cool.
In there. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.